Hi everyone, I'm Nadia, and in today's video I'm making a beautiful resin beach serving board. I did face a few obstacles while working with this serving board, which you guys will see throughout this video. But the very first thing I'm doing is prepping it and protecting it from getting resin on any unwanted areas. I'm putting painter's tape on the back side of the board near the edges, so that when the resin flows over the board, it won't cure onto the board but onto the tape, and it will be a lot easier to clean up. I'm also using an X-Acto knife to cut the tape around the handle so that it will fit the area perfectly. Once I'm done taping the back of the board, I flip the board around and start to tape the knives. Next, I'm putting tape onto the front side of the board where I don't want the resin to go past that point. And I'm going over the areas where I put the tape with the heat gun, which helps seal the tape so that the resin won't seep through as much. And I'm adding a piece of baking paper on the other half of the board where I want to protect it from accidentally getting any drops of resin. Once the board is all set, I start to mix my part A and part B resin together for around 3 to 5 minutes. I'm going to be using these used and empty Greek yogurt cups to prop up my serving board. Now I'm placing the small knives on top of the board, and I realized in my recent video where my mom made a similar board to this, I thought that she was using these mixing sticks to help keep them in place, but it's actually so that the small surface on the knives is more leveled. One mixing stick wasn't enough, so I added one more, and that was enough to level it out. And just to double check, I took a leveler to make sure that my board is leveled as well. Resin is self-leveling, so it's really important to make sure that your surface is leveled before you start working. I separate my resin into smaller cups, and the first pigment that I'm going to be using is dark turquoise by Just Resin, and this is a transparent pigment. With a small wooden stick, I mix the pigment in the container before I take a small amount and add it into my clear resin. The more pigment you add, the less transparent it is, and I wanted to do a lighter and darker variation, so I'm pouring some of the pigmented resin into a small cup of clear resin to get a lighter shade. And I decided to mix in some mica powders as well, and I went with a silver shade of mica powder as well as a teal shade of mica powder. I continued to add and mix together until I was satisfied with the shade. Now I'm mixing in my white pigment for the waves, and I'm using Just Resin's pigment paste in the shade Titanium White. Then I take my clear resin and outline where I want my resin to stop and my wave to start. I use a silicone makeup brush to push the resin up so that it doesn't spread down onto the tape. Then I start to pour my lighter shade of blue pigmented resin and use the silicone makeup brush again to spread it out. I continue to pour my resin onto the board, and I take my cup with the darker blue pigmented resin and pour it at the very top. Again, I use the makeup brush to spread and blend. I carefully add some resin onto the knives with a wooden stick. And I'm using my fingers to spread resin onto the very edges of the board. Now I'm ready to blow out my first wave, so I start applying the white pigmented resin right where the blue pigmented resin stops. And by using a heat gun, I blow out the waves. Right when I'm done with the heat gun, I use a torch gun, and I find that this helps to open up some of the lacing. I leave it to cure and come back the next day to add my second layer. Again, I mix my part A and my part B resin, and I'm immediately adding in my white pigment to do my second wave on the board, as well as small waves on the knives. I wanted to go for more of a deep, darker blue for the upper area of the board, and you'll see that this is where things start to go wrong. But I will get more into that later. I'm starting off with a blue Piñata alcohol ink. And because I didn't want it to have a green tint and I wanted it to be more of a dark blue, I added some purple alcohol ink. And I continued adding more drops and mixing it together. I poured some onto the board to test out the color, and I wanted it to be a little bit darker, so I added a few more drops of the purple alcohol ink. And you can probably guess that this is where things started to go wrong. After adding more of the drops, I was happy with the color and poured it onto the very top of the board. And I used the makeup brush to spread and blend the resin. And I poured some onto the knives as well. Using a wooden stick, I spread the resin to make sure that it covered the whole area. Then I started applying the white pigmented resin onto the knives. And I blew out the pigmented resin with a heat gun. I went back and added more white pigmented resin to make some touch-ups, and then used the torch gun to pop any air bubbles and to open up the lacing a bit. Then I started to fix up my shoreline from the wave that I blew out yesterday on the board, and I'm doing this just by having some white pigmented resin on the wooden stick and dragging it along the shoreline. And now I start to place my white pigmented resin to blow out my second wave on the board. I wasn't very happy with the result, so I added some more white pigmented resin and tried again. I wasn't having so much luck, and again I wasn't happy with how the wave came out, so I decided to completely wipe it off and try once more. This time was a little bit better, so I left the resin to harden and came back the next day. Keep in mind how the blue pigmented resin that I mixed and added onto the top of the board looks now, and this is how it looked the next day. Even though it looked blue while I was working with it, the next day it was completely purple. I was really shocked when I saw this just because it didn't look purple at all when I was working with it. But luckily my mom gave me some advice and suggested that I just add the dark turquoise pigmented resin from Just Resin that I used earlier. And because it's a cool shade of blue, it will completely cover up that purple. I ended up adding a lot of the pigment, so the pigment didn't end up being transparent at all. I went through the same process again of pouring the resin on the board and using the makeup brush to spread and blend. And I did the same on the knives since those were purple as well. I added my white pigmented resin where I wanted the waves to be, and with the heat gun I blew them out. I really wasn't having so much luck with waves on this second layer attempt, so I tried a few more times to add the white pigmented resin and blow it out with the heat gun until I was satisfied with how it looked. Then I moved on to do the waves on the knives. And the next day, the tape is ready to be taken off. I also do want to add that before I took the tape off, I did add a layer of food-safe resin onto the board so that food can be placed on the wave part of the board without any chemical contamination. For any areas where the tape doesn't come off easily, you can use the heat gun to heat up that area, and it will help a lot for the tape to come off as well as those resin droplets. After lots of cleaning up and sanding, here's the final product. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, subscribe to see more videos like this in the future. Follow me on my Instagram, Summer Girl Designs, and my mom's Instagram, Wild Heart Resin Art.